everyone, One Spittin' here. So this is a Tactica about creating army lists. I've been wanting to flesh out my series of Tactica videos, and this one I consider to be foundational, as obviously this happens well before the game ever starts. And I think that most people don't really think about what method they're using to create an army list. They just start creating it. And so I've tried to name 8 different approaches that I've noticed people using. And as with most things, I think people don't necessarily use a single approach. They probably use 2 or 3 different approaches combined. But I think for most people, they one of these will be their dominant approach they use. And then regardless of the specific approach you use, at the end of this, I want to share what I consider to be the most important thing that can be used, regardless of your approach, that probably has the most impact. So the first approach, I don't think most people would ever claim this necessarily, but I call it the current models approach. And I think this is really where you kind of say, I want to build as competitive a list as I can using the models I have. I think, I know there are some serious tournament players that they design their list first and then they go buy or create the models for that list. But I think that the majority of players don't do that. Their army evolves slowly over time, and while they're playing, they play with what they got, and I certainly do that. In fact, I would say that whenever you see my Empire list with a horde of halberdiers and a unit of inner circle knights, the reason I did that was because I needed points in core, and those are the models I had. And I didn't want to create an all-knight army because I play Bretonnia, and that's where I'm going to play for all knights. And I just didn't have it in me to create a second horde of halberdiers or swordsmen or something to fill out my core. So certainly, I'm saying it's not necessarily an ideal approach, but I think, I certainly use it a lot. Another one is a themed approach, and this is one that I haven't done too much of, but I really respect, and I really think themed lists add a lot to the game. And this is where somebody builds a list trying to make it as competitive as they can, but at the same time putting constraints on themselves, saying it has to match a certain theme. So the picture I'm showing here is of just a wonderfully painted Nurgle army that obviously is themed to Nurgle. Now that can be a very competitive build, but you could argue it would be more competitive if you had a spellcaster with a different mark and stuff like that. But a true themed lists don't do that. They say no, it has to stick with the theme. I know there's a player that I've played quite a bit back where I used to live that all of his armies were themed, and like I said, it really brings a lot to the game. So if you played Orcs and Goblins, he might show up with a 100% Knight Goblin army, which has some real disadvantages. It's hard to get good leadership with a Knight Goblin theme, but he's like, you know what, that's what I'm doing. Or if he played a Demon army, it would always only be 1 mark. I know the old Dark Elf books used to be able to build Knight armies. Wood Elves can build Forest Spirit armies. There's a lot of different ways to build themes. A couple ways I've done it is when I did my Minotaur-themed Beastman army, and I actually created or converted all my chariots to where they're being pulled by Minotaurs, because I wanted that to be the theme, that every model on the table was a Minotaur or had a Minotaur in it. And a couple of the most fun games I've ever had were the Bretonnian Peasant Revolts. And that was where both armies were themed. We had one of us would take a knight-themed army, and the other one would take a peasant-themed army, and then we would have a battle as if the peasants were rising up in revolt, and it just made for very, interesting, intriguing, and just fun games. So a third approach, and I don't think many people at all purposely do this. I'm doing it more, and I'm becoming more and more of an advocate of it, and this is what I'm calling the Underdog approach, and really what it is, it's building a list that you think you can make competitive, but if you were in a tournament and they forced you to trade armies with each other, that your opponent could not win with. So it's one that you're saying, you know what, I think I could win with this because it's going to be so unique, and I'm going to build it according, I'll know exactly how it plays. I don't think other people, it would not be as intuitive to them. And so a lot of times this means you're bringing unoptimized choices. They're not stupid choices. It can be thought out, but they're certainly not optimized. I think this is a fun way to play. I don't bring Underdog lists to tournaments anymore. I've done that a couple times. It did not work out well. But for friendly games, I'm bringing them more and more, and I think people should. I mean, for one, I think it helps you out as a player, develop your skills fighting uphill battles. 2, it takes a lot of pressure off the games because you're just going in to have fun. Win or lose, that there's a chance you're going to lose simply because of your list. you just blame it on your list and don't worry about it. I really think it's important to play underdog lists if you're playing somebody who's new to the game, and you want to help them develop as a player and learn the rules and then learn the strategies and be able to have a fun time doing it. It doesn't help anybody out to show up with overpowered lists and just crush them. I mean, do that. Bring your overpowered list later when they at least know the rules and strategies really well. As people are developing, bring a little bit softer lists and learn some strategies yourself as you're playing a softer list, and allow your opponent to have more fun as they learn the game. Another approach is what I call the Lynchpin, and this, I hear people talking sometimes when they talk about a list, and I'll hear them say things like, they're so excited about this one unkillable, unbreakable character or unit that's going to win the game all by itself. And they're not talking about the army as a whole. They're not talking about this one thing playing its part in the army. They're talking about this one thing just, it can't be killed, so then you're going to use it to win the game. And so it's the linchpin of the army. And if your opponent knows how to counter that one character or unit, then you're sunk. And so when people build a linchpin army, and they lose, they're like, I don't understand how I lost. I had this thing that was unkillable, unbreakable, and whatever. I think in editions gone by, we used to see it with Hero Hammer, where there were characters that were could kill anything and couldn't be killed. It's not true so much now. I mean, Demon Prince a little bit, but Demon Prince is certainly vulnerable to some things. I think the current version of this is more of Death Stars, where like in the picture here, if somebody puts enough Iron Guts into the same unit along with several characters, you can't hurt them with magic. Shooting can't hurt them enough. They're going to destroy anything they touch in close combat, and it just wins the game all by itself, unless it doesn't. This picture also includes a Doom Bull, which I think I've had a linchpin approach sometimes with my Doom Bull. I've put it in a list, and I realized in retrospect that I wasn't thinking about what else is on the list. I was thinking, I've got the Doom Bull, I just need to get him into combat, and I should win the game. And, anything can be countered. And so I think when people approach their list building this way, I think it's usually a very ineffective approach, because they're not thinking about the whole army. They're focused too much on one thing. And in this game, for those of you who have not watched and studied every single game I've ever played, this horde of Iron Guts charged my Doom Bull in the flank, and my Doom Bull slapped him around and broke him. So, yeah, those things happen. Another approach is what a lot of people refer to as min-max. And the way I interpret min-max is that you take the minimum amount of required choices that you have to. So if you have to fill out core requirements, then you do what you have to, but only to the bare minimum. For the most part, you max out on characters and units in your book that are underpriced for what they do. And every book has them. I mean, for one, I think it's difficult to create an army book that's perfectly balanced, where all the units are equally good for the points that they cost. But I also think that Games Workshop does that. Every book comes out, and every time a book comes out, there's 2 or 3 units that are underpriced in points, so it encourages people to run out and buy those things, and it helps their sales. So a min-max approach is one where you just see, oh, you brought all the underpriced stuff. I get it. That's as competitive as your army can be. So this can certainly be effective. I'm not knocking it necessarily, but I'm just pointing out that it's built on trying to have more on the table because you're bringing only underpriced things, as opposed to building a list that you're trying to accomplish a certain something. So when I see the Warriors of Chaos Chariot Demon Prince Chimera build, I think it's a very effective build. I'm not knocking people who take it. I'm saying it's a min-max strategy. When you see people taking 3 units of Empire Demigryph Knights, so all their special points are spelled on Demigryphs because Demigryphs are undercosted, that's this approach. Somebody taking Troll Hordes, again, I think Trolls are underpriced for what they do, so when somebody maxes out on them, they're following this approach. So not a bad approach, certainly. Another approach, and this is one that I think can be really neat and can be really frustrating, and for lack of a better term, I'm calling it focus and overwhelm. But it's where you build a list trying to overload one single aspect of the game. And so it's the kind of thinking that you don't have to win all aspects of the game. If you could win enough in one aspect of the game, you've got it. So simplified versions of this are when you see a gun line, or when you see somebody bringing a magic heavy army. And I say that hesitantly because I think Games Workshop in the recent past has moved away from army books where you could get that heavy on magic, but in the past you certainly could. But those are simplified approaches. I think in the lower left corner is it's a picture I turned into a cartoon and was using for my Tactica on the leadership bomb approach, which really can't be done now as well as it could be in the past under former army books. But the leadership bomb focuses on the one aspect of the game, leadership. It lowers your leadership automatically, it lowers your leadership through spells, and the whole purpose of this build is you have to take leadership tests. You're taking fear tests, you take a terror test when somebody charges you, you might lose combat, and whenever you take a leadership test, if you fail it, you're going to lose the game. The picture in the upper right is what I consider to be the worst I've ever been beaten in a game. A fantastic general with a really unique list, and what he was focusing on overloading was mobility. Everything was, not everything, most things in this army were fairly fragile. Lots of fast cav, lots of skirmishing infantry, and then a couple flying characters, and I mean there was like a Hydra, but for the most part it was, who fears fast cav, right? I couldn't get a charge almost the whole game. I rarely charged, and when I did, it was not advantageous. And he just danced around me the whole time, whittled away at me with shooting and with magic. And when he finally did get into combat, he could overwhelm me, and he got to dictate all the fights that happened. It was a brilliantly played game, a very well constructed list, and a great learning experience for me. So I think when somebody does it without the blunt edge approach like a gun line, but they do it with something like mobility, that can be for a very interesting, fun game. But all these kind of lists can also be a very frustrating game for opponents. Most people say they don't like to face gun lines, they don't like to face the old Slann with a million power dice, they don't like to face the leadership bomb army, and I think a lot of times that's because when you do face it, it's that one thing. If you know how to counter that one thing, you're going to win, and people who don't know how to counter that one thing, they're going to lose. It makes for a very effective list at tournaments. If you're gambling that the most people you face will not have ever played against this kind of list, you're probably going to win those games. Then there's what I would call a reactionary army list creation tactic. And what this means is that you create a list trying to react to your local meta or the meta that you perceive to be the current tournament meta. So when 8th edition first came out, for instance, everybody was bringing hordes, and it was so different from 7th edition and prior editions of Warhammer that hordes just won everything. And so then Games Workshop started having army books that had more monstrous cav in there, or in the case of this picture, the Doom Bull, which is with a particular build that was very anti-horde. And then hordes all of a sudden just got crushed by all these monstrous cavalry out there. I know there's a player locally that Ben from Bull City Wargaming. He was very successful in Beastmen at a time when ogres were the dominant army, the most competitive army in the meta. When you went to competitive tournaments, ogres were heavily represented. He felt that he had a Beastman build that countered ogres very well, and he won tournaments with it. It was very successful. People right now, a current popular build is the Monster Chariot spam from the Warriors of Chaos, but then you see people countering that with bringing more cannons, more ranged attacks, heavier magic phases designed to kill monsters, things like that. So this approach to list building is when you're not thinking about everything you might face, you're thinking, what am I likely to face with the 5 players I normally play, or with at the current tournament scene. And then there's the Toolkit approach, and I have to give credit to Malorian for calling this the Batman approach. He created a video called Analysis of a Legend, talking about me, and I don't know how to respond to that, but he said that this is the approach I use, and I couldn't agree more. I think this is my favorite approach, although I think there are other approaches that play a part as well. But in the Batman approach, the Toolkit approach, really what you're saying is, I want to make sure that no matter what I face, I have something in my arsenal with which to deal. So, if you come with monsters, I've got something to take care of monsters. You have hordes, I have something to take care of hordes. And I like it because then I think I have a chance in every game. The downside is if somebody overloads on one aspect of it, I've got a tool to deal with it, but that tool can get overwhelmed and the rest of the army might suffer. But again, I think that's what makes it intriguing, because it doesn't mean the game's lost. You just have to figure out how to deal with it. So people that use this approach, what they're usually what they're worried about is, they're not worried about, what they're thinking of is, what if I run into this? What if I run into that? How am I going to deal with it? And then you just put elements in your army, to deal with all those things. So those are the 8 approaches. Here's what I think is most important. Whatever approach you use, I think it's helpful to realize, become aware of the approach that you naturally use, and then decide if that's an approach you want to use or if there might be a better approach. As with most things, I think it's hard to break habits, and it can be helpful if you realize you use a certain approach to force yourself to use a different approach just for a few games and see if it opens your eyes to some things. But whatever approach you use, I really think the most important thing is an overall strategic plan that informs the list that you build, and then the way that you deploy, and the way that you move, and the spells that you choose to cast, and all those things. And I think the first most important question is, how is this list going to win games? What's it designed to do? And this is a realization I had over the last few months playing Empire, where I think I had a decent list. It was a list with counters to a lot of things I might face. But in retrospect, I was playing it without really an understanding of how is this list going to win games. And it's a hard question to answer. Sometimes you can't just sit down and come up with it. I think it takes some play testing and getting used to a certain army. I think that when I was relatively successful with Bretonnians at a time when most people were discounting Bretonnians as a competitive army in 8th edition, I think it's because I understood Bretts. I understood how they won games, and I understood why they lost games, and it worked for me. Another question I think is very important is, what role does each character or unit play in this plan of yours? And I've seen people do this on forums when they propose army lists, and they'll go through and they'll list everything, and next to everything they'll say, this is what this thing does. This is what this thing does. And and so that you can tell the thinking behind it is their choices are determined by what roles they're playing. How do my units need to work together? This is especially important in lists such as the Focus and Overwhelm, where you're not just putting a list to go on the table and insta-win. They have to do certain things, and they need to do them together. In the Leadership Army, you have to get certain characters and banners close together so they can double up on their effects. In a lot of low leadership armies, you have to make sure that you have a leadership bubble, and since that bubble can't cover the whole board, that it's covering the most important things. So hammer and anvil tactics work into this. Number 4, how do I need to use the board and terrain to get the advantages I need? Or at least understanding how the board and terrain are going to affect things, and what is your plan with this specific army build. So is this one that you want to spread out across the table because things work independently very well? Is this one where you need to huddle together? Do you want to be in the middle so you can make sure you can reach your opponent no matter where he or she is? Or do you want to huddle up in a corner? So, do you need to avoid forests, or do you need to be near a forest? I mean, all those kind of things, just understanding how that works with your army, because every game you play, the terrain will be different. I think you should have an intuitive sense of what matchups you want to get and what matchups you want to avoid. I don't mean in terms of opponents, I mean in terms of no matter who your opponent is, when you see their army on the table, what are the good matchups or the bad matchups? And I think you need to think about how you're going to counter expected threats. I think every army build has weaknesses, and if you get a bad matchup in terms of an army, how are you going to deal with that? Are there certain things you expect to see, kind of in a reactionary approach, that I think you should always think about? Is there things you expect to see, and how are you going to handle those things? So I think a strategic plan, no matter what approach you use, is the most important thing. So that's it for my list building Tactica. I hope you enjoyed it.